Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'll have to be a little bit distracted here as people come in. I have to admit them to the meeting, so that'll be fun. Um, but I would like to welcome you all to the course today. Had a lot of returning. That's good. So this course is entitled "The Greenest Building is the One Already Built," and we will be kind of thinking about that today. So I apologize. It's jumpy as I get going here. So we've got 4 learning objectives. I'll leave that up for just a moment and let you all take a look at that. Can you all hear the doorbell as people come into the meeting? Is that something that's going to be distracting?
Nope, we can't hear it.
Oh, you can't. Okay, that's good. It's distracting me, but we'll get through that. Okay. So course description. I'm going to read through this. You've no doubt heard the phrase, the greenest building is the one that is already built, but what does this mean? We'll unpack today how existing buildings and specifically historic buildings are sustainable. We'll delve into best practices to achieving a sustainable historic rehabilitation and discuss how that benefits the health, safety, and wellness of the user, both as an occupant of the building and as an occupant of the landscape. Put a couple more people in here. Sustainability is a broad term that has come to mean more than just environmental responsibility. A building is both sustainable on the inside and the outside. Sustainable buildings support the physical, psychological, and social health and well-being of people in the buildings and the built environment. Older buildings are essential in sustaining successful cities and neighborhoods, and historic buildings help to create economically vibrant, socially equitable, and resilient neighborhoods. Okay, my name is Stephen Cornell. I'm the State Historical Architect here with the State Historic Preservation Office. It's a mouthful to say. And I should note that we do have, the support of AIA Utah. They've been in getting the word out on these lectures and kind of advertising the lectures. So I appreciate their support and their help on these. So with that, let's jump in and begin the course. So the question that I'd like to pose initially, kind of take the title of the course and turn it into a question is the greenest building the one already built? And what you're looking at here is a promotional campaign poster that the National Trust for Historic Preservation put out in 1980. So back in the 80s, preservation took a different tack. They still played on that nostalgia that was remaining from the bicentennial celebration in '76, but now they were playing to a wider audience. During the energy crisis that sort of hit us at the tail end of the '70s, and in other words, it helped Americans save money by reusing buildings. And it helped them feel better about preserving old buildings, as well as, I'm sure, helping them feel better about themselves. What the poster says in the fine print at the bottom is energy equivalent of 1 gallon of gasoline to make, deliver, and install 8 bricks. Preserving bricks instead of throwing them away and making new ones means that the energy of 1 gallon of gasoline can be used to meet other needs. So there's the question, is the greenest building the one already built? And the answer to that, of course, is kind of. So in terms of material reuse, I think the answer is fairly cut and dried. Sorry, I was just looking at the waiting room, make sure I got everyone in. But in terms of material reuse, it's cut and dried. It's, yes, I think that historic and existing buildings are, the greenest ones. In terms of energy use, it becomes more difficult and fraught to answer that question. When we're speaking about green buildings or sustainability, what we're talking about is architecture that seeks to minimize the negative impact on the environment, and focuses on energy and ecological conservation in the design of the built environment. And when I think of sustainable architecture, it really is an architectural genre. One that aestheticizes the environmental systems and features of its sustainable character. And this, if you don't know this project, this is a project that was built in the early 2000s. This is called BEDZ, and it's named after Beddington Zero Energy Development. This is in Hackbridge, London, England. It's kind of a borough outside of London. And, it was the first sustainable neighborhood to be built and constructed. And it had zero carbon emissions. And, like I said, it was the first large scale community to do so. And what you're seeing here in the architecture, obviously, is, these passive systems that are part of the architectural building. That's what I think of when I think of sustainable architecture. Now it's evolved a bit since the early 2000s, but it takes on a bit of a different meaning when we speak about historic buildings, because we don't really want to see those systems and features that define a sustainable example of architecture. So as always, I kind of go back to the Rio Grande because that's a good case study, I think, for what we're doing. This is from the Salt Lake Tribune, August 14th, 1910, and this is the day before the Rio Grande opened. And they were kind of identifying and featuring all of the assets that the Rio Grande brought to the community. And they were very excited about this palatial new good terminal, soon to open to traveling public. This was a large space, and it remains a large space today. The center portion of the building contains a waiting room 144 feet long by 83 feet wide, with a clear height of 58 feet from floor to ceiling. This large room is lighted by 3 immense arched windows on each side, each 28 by 30 feet, through green opalescent glass. And I'll talk more about green opalescent glass in just a minute. But the volume of space that we're talking about that needs to be heated and cooled, and we're just talking about the grand, this central portion of building, is, the volume of space is 693,216 cubic feet. To kind of quantify that and to help us understand that, I thought I would convert that to venti coffees at Starbucks, and that's 33,187,920 venti coffees at Starbucks. So that should help you kind of understand the volume of space. The point is, it's massive. And to heat and cool that space required something extraordinary that we don't typically do in our work today, but it required its own dedicated heating and cooling plant, or heating plant. It's a coal-fired power plant, basically. And what you're looking at is the Sanborn map from 1911. And so this is oriented, so north is to the left, but to the south you see this, this brick building it's called the Salt Lake City Union Depot Railroad Company heating plant. So that was a dedicated facility just to heat the Rio Grande, and it ran the lights and it ran the steam radiators. And it was located, 500 feet from the building. So there was an immense amount of energy that was likely lost as it, made its way from this heating plant to the Rio 500 feet away. The heating and lighting plants have been located in a separate building. And they ran the heat, steam, and the lights, like I said. Sorry about that. I'm just showing you an image of that grand space prior to the installation of glass on the left and after the installation of glass on the right. And I mentioned that these windows had green opalescent glass, and you can see before the glass was installed how that light is just filtering through into that west. Keep in mind, this building has the same windows on the east and west. Let a few more people in. And what that means is, if there weren't any mitigations to those window systems, if it was just clear glazing, the BTUs lost per square foot would be enormous. And so what this chart is basically showing how many BTUs are lost during various months of the year and during various times of day. And you can see at some point we get up to 5,000 BTUs per square foot, in an hour. So that's a significant amount of energy loss in the building just because of the window systems. And this is just a close-up of those windows showing the green opalescent glass. So opalescent glass is just a kind of a milky glass type. It's got kind of streaky colors. This happened to be tinged green. It was developed in the late 19th century during a period called the opalescent era. And it really was, something that was both aesthetic and functional. So, I talked just a moment ago about sustainable systems and how those in, contemporary terms are, expressed and exposed as part of the architecture. In some fashion, this was using that same approach. It was putting a very functional element on the building, expressing that element in the green opalescent glass and making it part of that aesthetic, style of the building. So there are some, connections that we can make between historic building systems and contemporary systems. So even with new windows, new insulated glass windows, I thought I'd run just an envelope comm check on how it performed, hoping that it did better than it would, so that I could end the presentation here and just say, yes, historic buildings are the greenest buildings built. However, it failed, not surprisingly. It was 185% worse than code. So that means that it's probably not the greenest building built. So just generally speaking, when we're talking about sustainable design, it's more than just materials that go into the building. That's a big part of what we mean when we talk about sustainability. It's reusing, recycling, and conserving what we have. But really, it's about optimizing site potential. It's about optimizing energy use, protecting and conserving water. It's about optimizing building space and material use, enhancing indoor environmental quality, and optimizing operation and maintenance practices. So just thinking about these strategies and these goals, how do we make a historic building more sustainable? And that takes us to the first learning objective, which is, what are sustainable systems or historic sustainable systems that we see in existing buildings and historic buildings? So we'll go through some of those as we go through this little section. This is a publication that the Secretary of the Interior has put out for our benefit when we work on historic buildings. And it's basically an illustrated guide to making historic buildings more sustainable in ways that meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. So again, I'm always kind of going back to what would make your building eligible for federal tax credits. And the guidelines and the rules and regulations are fairly strict. But this is a guide that will help you, make decisions, make good decisions about how to make your building more sustainable while also meeting the Secretary of the Interior standards. So just going back to the Rio, I wanted to talk about some of the inherent sustainable features in the Rio Grande. And we've talked about the opalescent glass. That significantly cut down the heat gain and heat loss in the building. So it's basically an opaque glass. You still get some light filtering through, but it significantly reduces the amount of visible light transmittance that comes into the building. And, by the same token, reduces the heat gain. The next system that was utilized historically were window shades. And, any historic building back in the day would have had some type of window shading device, whether it was a canopy, a soft canopy like you see in the image on the right, or whether it was a harder canopy that helped to shade the windows or the storefronts. These were typically movable, so you could move them throughout the day, depending on where the sun was and how bright it was. So these were very, user-friendly systems that someone could essentially, alter their environment simply pulling a lever. Let's see what else in there. So this was one way to, condition the interior of the building. It helped to reduce the heat gain in the building, reduce the impact that the boiler needed to make on the building. And again, just to kind of talk about the gains in this in using a system like this, the Department of Energy has indicated that awnings can reduce heat gain up to 65% in south-facing windows and up to 77% on windows facing east. Now, I don't know why the particular reference here doesn't talk about west-facing windows. Maybe it's not significant enough to talk about, but these types of systems are important, and they do make a difference in the overall function of the building when it comes to being efficient. Eave overhangs. That's another system that was employed in the Rio. And what this allows is for shadows to be cast over the windows and thus reducing the heat gain of the windows. And obviously when I talk about overhanging eaves or cantilevered eaves, I think about prairie style, and that was such a prominent style throughout the United States in the early 20th century. A lot of the buildings that were built in that style had sort of, embedded in their architecture this very passive, cooling system. And I don't know that we think about that today because we're so reliant on mechanical systems, mechanical means of heating and cooling buildings. The last one that the Rio kind of employs architecturally on its exterior are transom windows. Transom windows are great. They can be opened to increase airflow in a space. We kind of get that circulation of air flowing from hot. But there are a lot of other systems that were employed in historic buildings as well, such as, the thermal mass of masonry walls. And again, in the Rio, that's expressed on the exterior, and that just essentially says that the thermal mass collects heat or takes on heat during the day, and then is slow to give that off during the night when it's cooler. So low slope roofs or clay tiles, again, that's kind of something the Rio expresses. Light wells, bringing light into the interior spaces of buildings. Vestibules, which help to kind of mitigate between the outside and the inside. Monitors and sawtooth windows, like you see here on the image on the right from a building up in Brigham City. And courtyards. These were all passive features to, utilize the environment to, to take advantage of the environment to condition the spaces in historic buildings. There was a publication put out, I think this is 1984, so it's a bit dated, but it still has some good information in it. This is John Burns, who is one of the architects with the National Park Service back in Washington, D.C., but he identifies, energy conserving features inherent in older homes. And so to that list, his book adds splayed window reveals, high ceilings, interior transoms or borrowed light. So if you can't really see behind me here, but I've got an interior transom in my office. And before all of these office partitions were built, it really was meant to take light from the outside and transfer it into the corridor, which sits in the center of the building. Shutters and chimneys. So that kind of takes us to the end of that. We'll jump in and start talking about, we've got passive features that help to make our buildings more sustainable. How do we utilize those? How do we enhance those? Do we, bring some features back that may have been lost, like canopies, et cetera? But now we'll kind of talk about what changes we can to the actual building, to the systems, things like that, to make it more energy efficient. So I thought this graph was interesting. This is from the Preservation Green Lab, and it's from the publication on the right, which was put out just a few years ago, called The Greenest Building, Quantifying the Environmental Value of Building Reuse. And they look at, this is looking at buildings today and how they're functioning and operating today, but looking at their energy needs by building era. And what we're seeing in buildings built before 1920 is that they basically use less energy. Now that may be due to a number of factors, like there may be less computers in the building. They might have older mechanical systems. They might not have cooling in the building. So some of those things play into this data. But what you can see is that there is, over time, as buildings become newer and more efficient, they also use more BTUs. This is looking at just residential construction, but it's residential energy use intensity by age of building. And what you can see, and I'm not sure if this is saying that, it's looking at the energy use of a building built in 1950, or if it's looking at a building built in 1950, that's sort of operating today. That's there. And let's see. They know there was a performance benefit. They did know there was a performance benefit to it. I mean, that's why they put it in. I'm not sure if they could quantify that, but it significantly, would have, reduced the, the uncomfortable nature of that space if you had not had, some kind of a mid in the windows. So thanks, John, for that question. So anyway, just looking back at the slide, what we can see over time is that buildings are utilizing or using less energy the newer they become. And this graph obviously stops in 2005. Energy codes and building codes have only gotten stricter since then, so I would imagine that this trend would continue to today. So one thing the National Park Service has done, and I've talked about these in some of the previous presentations, but they have published what they call preservation briefs. And these briefs, treat different topics on how to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. And one of the briefs that is, given to us is Preservation Brief 3, which is improving energy efficiency in historic buildings. And this brief was intended to help property owners, preservation professionals, and the like, to make good decisions about how to make energy upgrades in historic buildings and still meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. And what they've identified in this brief are, two approaches to how to best, deal with this. One is operational improvements, and the second is building upgrades. And so I'll talk a little bit about both of those. So operational changes, this is something that I think we're all pretty aware of, but it includes installing programmable thermostats, closing off rooms that are not in use, not conditioning rooms that don't need to be conditioned, thereby reducing the thermal envelope, using insulated shades and curtains to control heat gain, using operable windows, shutters, awnings, and vents as originally intended to control temperature and ventilation, taking advantage of natural light, installing compact fluorescence, and this is obviously a bit dated, as you can see, or LED lights, which is the standard nowadays. Installing motion detectors and timers for lighting and local ventilation, such as bathroom exhaust fans, and reducing phantom electricity loads by turning equipment off when not in use or unplugging them when not in use, and cleaning and servicing mechanical equipment regularly. And then speaking about building upgrades, these are active changes that we make to the building, and there are minimal upgrades that we can make, and there are major upgrades that we can make. And the minimal ones, the easy ones, the low-hanging fruit are reducing the air leakage of the building. That's a pretty easy one to take care of, and it's estimated that leakage of air into a building can account for 5 to 40% of space conditioning costs. So that's the easy one to get. Adding weather stripping to doors and windows, that's something that I think anybody can pretty well do on their own. Doesn't take a specialized contractor to do these sorts of things. Sealing the intersections of walls and attics, etc. Adding attic insulation, another one that a lot of historic homes don't have attic insulation or didn't have attic insulation initially. So, that basically reduces the heat loss and gain caused by, temperature differentials. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these, but, some of them obviously are easier to take care of than others. Installing storm windows, that's going to be a little more expensive. It doesn't require any alteration to the building. And there are companies out there that make a pretty good friction fitted storm window. So you don't have to alter the existing window in any way. You get them sized, custom built, and you basically just put them up and in, and they just are held in that space by friction. So they're really a slick system. You can take them out, clean them quite easily. They're very tight. They're tighter than the original window, which is what we want, so that we get condensation out of the window out to the outside, moving to the outside. So vapor is evaporated and moves to the outside. Insulating basements and crawl spaces. That's something that's a little more intense, requires a little more thought, but something that can easily be done. Sealing and insulating ducts and pipes. We talked about weather stripping doors and adding storm doors, and adding awnings and shading devices where appropriate. And then there are some upgrades which require, maybe a bit more of an intensive alteration, such as adding interior vestibules, replacing windows in kind. So, maybe the windows are so deteriorated that they just need to be replaced with a new window. And again, speaking of historic buildings, this is kind of the biggest issue that we see today when we're doing or reviewing tax credit projects. Old steel framed windows or old deteriorated wood windows just don't perform very well. They can be rehabilitated, but in the case of a steel window, it's always going to be a thermal bridge to the outside. So you're always going to have this energy transfer through that window system. So, in some of those cases, it may make sense to replace the window in kind with a higher performing window. something to think about again is installing a storm window. That's kind of the, the easy way to go. When I did Ogden High School about 10 years ago, the old steel windows were a very defining feature of the building, very characteristic of the building, but they just did not function very well. There was a lot of heat gain, during the afternoon hours, a lot of heat loss during the winter. And the client on that project decided that they would, replace all of the steel windows. And so we found a comparable, not an exact, but a comparable match to those steel windows in an aluminum window. And, went through all the proper procedures and channels and the review processes, and those were approved to be installed. So it's, if you've got a, excuse me, if you have a, historic window, it's not that you can't replace it, but, what is that replacement? What are the features of that replacement, and how do you go about that? Adding insulation to wood frame walls, insulation to masonry walls. This requires you to modify pretty significantly the interior spaces of the building. In some cases that may not be a big deal. In some cases it may add, some function to the building. If you fur out a masonry wall, then you've got a place to put in, your electrical outlets. You can run electrical wire. So it adds some features that just, weren't easily added before. But you always need to be aware of, water vapor and what that's doing to the building. So in some cases that may be appropriate on masonry buildings to add insulation to the masonry wall. In some cases it may not be. And you may have enough capacity in that thermal mass to mitigate those temperature differences throughout the day. So that's something to take into account when considering, how do I make this building more efficient? You're going to gain something by adding insulation to the walls, but in the case of a masonry wall, it may be, it may not be as much as you think. Installing cold roofs and green roofs. And I just lost my notes. So cold roofs help reduce heat gain from the roof, thereby cooling the building and its environment. Sorry, go back a slide. Cold roofs can include reflective metal roofs, light colored or white roofs, or fiberglass shingles that have coating of reflective crystals. These are all types of cool or cold roofs. They may not be appropriate in historic buildings, however. So again, installing a cold roof or a cool roof on a building, while that makes sense in new buildings, in roof areas that might not be seen, it doesn't make sense in all situations, in instances. So again, that's something to be aware of. It'd be great if we could make all of our roofs cool, if we could, install vegetation in all of our roofs, but that's not always the best approach with historic buildings. So with that, let's jump to learning objective 3. And this is, really where we kind of look at new sustainable features and technologies and how to integrate those into historic buildings. And I'm not going to give any, horrendous examples of what not to do. What I'm going to focus on really are, a couple of good approaches to, to how this type of thing has been done on historic buildings. The biggest question we get is, can I put solar panels on the roof of my historic building? And of course, the answer is maybe, as all good answers are. So I don't know how many of you know, but, I look to governmental examples of what to do and what not to do on historic buildings. And this is, probably near the beginning of Jimmy Carter's term. That's Jimmy Carter, if you don't know, as a young man. And he's standing on one of the wings at the White House. And you can see he's pretty happy about the installation of these solar panels, which would essentially heat water for the interior of the building. they're pretty big, they're pretty intrusive on that historic fabric of the building. And it, the next president, which you'll remember was, um, well, you'll remember if you were around back then, was Ronald Reagan. And I think that what his take was, he didn't like the impact on the historic fabric of the White House. So he had those removed. There were 32 solar panels installed on the west wing of the roof by Jimmy Carter, and these panels were used to heat water in the household for 7 years until Ronald Reagan had them removed in 19. Stored in a government warehouse until 1991. And what I think is really interesting is, they were acquired by the National Museum of American History, or they were loaned to the National Museum of American History in 2009. So now they're on display at the National Museum of American History. So you can go and see these old solar panels there at the Smithsonian. So this is an example of how to put solar panels on a roof of a historic building. This is the Wayne Aspinall Federal Building in Grand Junction, Colorado. It's a pretty, amazing building for Grand Junction. It's quite nice, quite extravagant. And about, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the GSA did a major renovation on this building with the goal of, making this building sustainable. It's a 1918 landmark, and it's currently one of the most energy efficient, sustainable historic buildings in the country. It was funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and the $15 million project aims to be GSA's first net zero energy facility on the National Register. It achieved a LEED Platinum rating and scores in the top 2% of LEED and C version 2009. So it's a very iconic project and a very successful project. And so I like to look at this as a case study example of what to do and what not to do. They did a lot of things right in this renovation. So this type of renovation or rehabilitation is something that we call sustainable preservation. It's preserving the building but making it sustainable. It includes the restoration of historic volumes and finishes within both public and work spaces, and they've used innovative building systems to allow these buildings' prominent spaces to be preserved and showcased. So to meet its lofty goals, including energy independence and energy efficiency, which is 50% better than code, the design included a building physics analysis, a roof canopy mounted with a 123 kilowatt photovoltaic array, including on-site electricity generation. The equivalent of heating or powering 15 average homes. And then they did all of these kind of other interventions that we've been talking about. But what I really want to focus on are, the solar panels and why they did what they did. So again, when we're thinking about historic buildings, we don't really want to see modern interventions, modern sustainable systems on our historic buildings, especially if it's, something that's on the National Register. If we're pursuing tax credits, there are a lot of restrictions that come with, getting those tax credits at the end of the day. So, I look at the building from this angle, and it looks pretty intrusive on the historic fabric of the building. They've essentially built this penthouse over the top of some existing structures, elevator towers, stair towers, and the like. And in order to create, to get the energy that they needed for this particular project, they had to, put the solar panels above all of those features of the building. So just looking at the section, this is on the right side of that section is the main street facade of the building. And you can see that that pedestal or that canopy structure is set back from the face of the building. So they've got a lower set of solar panels on the kind of the front, maybe, quarter of the building. And then they've created this, this system, this raised pedestal system where they've got, the bulk of the solar panels. What that does is from the street, you don't see that, that canopy or those interventions from the street level of the building. So, that main facade, which is what we're really concerned about, has essentially remained, it's remained unchanged from its historic condition. So when you look at this, it still maintains that historic character, that historic presence that it had, when it was built in 1918. And that's really what we're talking about. So yes, you can add solar panels to the roof of your building, but we want it done in such a way that it doesn't undermine or, detract from that historic character of the building. These are a couple of images that I pulled. This is the backside of the building, and obviously from the backside you can see that large canopy structure. So that's that's acceptable in this project because it obviously, this is the backside of the building. This is where the parking areas are. It doesn't affect the overall character of the building on that side. I wanted to also turn to a project that's local, and this is a pretty interesting project. And some of you may remember, there was an article back in 2008 in Popular Science about this project. But this is the Major Downey Mansion. It's on South Temple. It's 808 East South Temple. And, it was a house that was designed by Frederick Hill in 1893. And he was a prominent Salt Lake City architect. A number of his buildings remain extant today. But the law firm of Lear and Lear purchased this mansion and moved in, and they wanted to see it renovated as their primary office space. This was really kind of they bought it at the tail end of Hurricane Katrina, and oil prices had soared because of a shortage. And so, these two lawyers, which, they focused on oil and gas law, decided that they would, create a sustainable building system to heat and cool this building. And John Lear, who's on the left there, his brother Phil is on the right, and you can see their dog kind of in the background. They really kind of innovated this system. They're smart guys, they're thoughtful guys, and they came up with this system to utilize the heat from the sewer that runs past their building. And you can kind of see a diagram of how that works on the right. It's basically pulling heat off of the sewer to heat and cool the building, or dumping heat into the sewer. And that's covering about 95% of the building's needs on a day-to-day basis. When they can't quite get to the cooling or heating that they want, they have a tub of gray water in the basement of the building that supplements that primary system. So all the gray water goes into that. They utilize that gray water, and then they use that gray water. When the tub fills up, they use that to irrigate the landscaping on the site. So it's really quite an innovative system. Driving past, you'd never know that this was happening inside this building, but it's been in place for a number of years, and it's worked remarkably well. I don't think it's quite caught on like they thought it would. I don't know of any other projects that have utilized a geothermal or a sewer thermal system like they have. But it's kind of a lost opportunity in my mind. one that really could be utilized on a larger scale rather than just one building. But this is a pretty interesting project nonetheless. This building's on the National Register. It was a tax credit project, and it's utilizing a pretty slick system to achieve basically a net zero energy footprint. So if you get a chance, take a stroll up South Temple and take a look at this building. Last learning objective is, repurposing old buildings reduces the need for construction of new buildings and the consumption of land, energy, materials, and financial resources that they require. And so in addition to all of these quantifiable measures, the reuse of historic buildings creates a qualitative return, a more livable, sustainable community, one which is economically vibrant, socially equitable, and resilient. And so we'll finish up with this, with a discussion on this. So I want to start with this image, of this group of people at the Embarcadero in San Francisco. And I'm sorry if I'm missing some of the questions. Maybe what we'll do is just get to those at the end instead of interrupting the presentation at this point. So if you'll be patient, I'll see if I can get to those questions at the end. So this is an image of thousands of people gathered at the Embarcadero on a Pokemon Go adventure. I don't remember exactly what year this was, but it was a 7-hour event that spanned 3.5 miles. And you can see, everyone's on their phone, they're sort of in the moment, enjoying what they're doing. And I've got this, only 10 or 20 years ago, futurists and technologists promised us that place would become irrelevant. And I think today, in today's terms, in 2020, 2021, we've kind of run through that experiment and put it to the test. And, I don't know that it's entirely been successful. That might be just my personal take on it, but, I don't think that place has become irrelevant yet. Futurists promised that we would all live and work and connect with the world via the internet, free to roam anywhere we chose, but millions of years of evolution are tough to shake. And we remain social creatures and continue to seek connection, delight, and fulfillment in real physical spaces. And, when I speak of delight, I want to make sure that we find the delight in this group of people. You can see this individual is delighting in his ice cream. So, that's kind of a physical manifestation of place. He's occupying that space and enjoying it. So I would argue that the digital age has not replaced the need for place, at least not yet. And, when I talk about, sustainability and historic buildings, that what really defines a sustainable building and community and neighborhood is the character of place. And, I wanted to sort of contrast, two versions of place that are very prominent in our everyday landscape. One of which is Jordan's Landing, and one of which is, a typical main street in Utah. This one happens to be Helper, Utah. And, coming in a little closer to both of those places, what makes a place and what do we want to get out of a place? Both of these have a commercial economy. Both are gathering spaces. Both have civic connections. You can see the clock tower and the flag on the image on the left. Both have relatively nice views. They both have street amenities, sidewalks, landscaping, parking, storefronts connecting the inside to the outside. And they both have a degree of architectural diversity. So the question that I would pose is, where would you rather spend your time? And some of you may say, well, I'd rather spend my time at Five Guys there at Jordan's Landing because it's lunchtime, and that's fine. One of these is a bit of an imposter, though. It's sort of copying what the original has, the inherent features in that original. And to kind of drive the point home, this is a throwback to the 80s, when I was kind of growing up in the 80s. And, Pro Wings on the left were a knockoff of the Reeboks on the right. And, the cool kids wore the Reeboks. Kids like me wore the Pro Wings. And, the Pro Wings were an obvious imposter. They were made of impervious plastic. The Reeboks were soft, breathable leather. Pro Wings had soles on hardwood floors. Reeboks stuck like Spider-Man. Pro Wings fell apart after about 2 months, and Reeboks seemed to always look new. At least that was the impression that I had. So thinking about that, thinking about what the original is, what are the inherent qualities in that original cityscape that we're looking at, that we're talking about? What makes those places more sustainable, more economically viable, more friendly to the occupant of those spaces? And the National Trust for Historic Preservation has actually done some studies on this with their Older, Smaller, Better series. And, they basically looked at a lot of data points to try to figure out, are older, smaller, better, older and smaller buildings better? What's the character of those buildings? How do those influence urban vitality? And thus, how do they sort of, create this sustainable environment that we're after? So what they did was they looked at existing structures across various urban landscapes. The key findings were that older mixed-use neighborhoods are more walkable. Young people love old buildings. Nightlife is most alive on streets with a diverse range of building ages. Older building districts provide affordable, flexible space for entrepreneurs from all backgrounds. The creative economy thrives in older mixed-use neighborhoods. And older, smaller buildings provide space for a strong local economy. And, they looked at three urban areas pretty intently, one of which was San Francisco. And this is kind of the data that they collected in San Francisco. And they came up with what they called a character score. And the character score that you see there is on the left. And it was derived from, I'm gonna have to read my notes here. It was derived from, statistically assessed relationships between characteristics and 40 economic, social, cultural, and environmental performance metrics. So each city was divided into a grid of 200 meters by 200 meters square. And the squares composed commercial and mixed-use areas of the city, and they were analyzed using statistical models. And they came up with this character score after they input all of these various metrics. So what's interesting about this is, the character score basically is saying that, the redder it is, the higher the score on the image on the left. And as you look at what's, those three images on the right, what you can see is that character score is highly correlated to, areas that have older buildings, so that median building age, a diversity of building age, and a granularity, which is just basically the size and number of buildings within a given area. So there's a strong correlation, not causation, but correlation between older, smaller, buildings and this character score. The National Trust also kind of expanded this study in the Atlas of Reurbanism. They didn't look at all of these cities as closely as the three that were studied in the Older, Smaller, Better study, but they did look at Salt Lake, and I found it interesting what they found in Salt Lake. Again, what they found was, in denser neighborhoods, in older neighborhoods, in neighborhoods with smaller buildings, a more granular collection of buildings, there was increased economic vitality, increased inclusiveness, and increased density and diversity within that area. And this is a couple of the graphics that were generated as part of that study. for Salt Lake. And again, what you can see is, sort of in these granular, older, historic, parts of Salt Lake City, you get a lot more character. You've got more foreign-born individuals, more people that are new to the country, more people of color. So all of these indicate that these are the type of neighborhoods that we're after. These are real neighborhoods. There's not a monolithic cultural quality to these neighborhoods, but there's a lot of economic diversity, cultural diversity, and it really kind of makes these neighborhoods vibrant and sustainable. It makes these neighborhoods good places to be. It attracts new people to these neighborhoods. This is where people want to live and work, and they want to inhabit these spaces. So with that, I think we're kind of to the end of the presentation. So I wanted to just quickly, provide our contact information again. So if you've got a project that's looking at tax credits, please reach out to us. We can, help you through some of these questions and concerns, and, essentially help you decide if a tax credit project is right for you or for your client. I wanted to highlight the course next month, which is Short History of Historic Preservation in Utah, and that's part of Preservation Month next month, which is May. So we've got a lot of events happening in May. If you get a chance, come to our website, take a look at what we've got going on. There's a lot of good speakers, a lot of interesting topics to look at next month. So I would encourage you all to come and take a look at that. And of course, if you've missed one of our lectures and you want to go back or just kind of review what we've talked about, you can always go to our our YouTube channel and look at some of these lectures that we've been doing this year. We've got a lot of good information on there, but we've got a channel that is, or a playlist that's specific to these courses we've been doing. So with that, we've got a few minutes left, and I will entertain questions.